Hi guys, so today we're diving into the most chilling horror podcast of the decades, Magnus Archives. Horror fiction isn't the most conventional way to get into the holiday season, but conventional isn't exactly a virtue in horror circles. No sir, so let's do it. Magnus Archives is a story about a paranormal activity research institute that starts out as a creepy anthology of cases from the institute's archives. But later on, we get into the dark nature of the institute itself, as seen through the eyes of its head archivist, Jon Sims. Magnus Archives feels like an Eldritch horror that takes human fear and makes it into a very real entity that watches you, suffocates you, and revels in your dread. The podcast is a complete thrill. The stories are gritty, backed by hair-raising sound design, often leaving us with something to think about. In this video, we'll bust open the terrifying world of the Magnus Archives for you, what the series is all about, and give it a star rating. There are going to be some spoilers, but we'll keep it pretty general, without too many plot details. Towards the end, though, we are going to break down 2 episodes. But before we go on, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing. It's a small click for you, but it means the world to us. Thank you. Magnus Archives, an introduction. Before I knew such a thing as the Magnus Archives existed, if anyone had told me that a horror fiction podcast was capable of making my hair stand on end as I compulsively consume one whole season on a binge, I would have had to agree to strongly disagree. A seasoned Lovecraftian horror or an eerie cyberpunk is much more my thing. Audio horror is completely off my radar if I'm being honest. But now that I've gone through the Magnus Archives podcast, that thought is as redundant as yesterday's newspaper. Magnus Archives started out as a podcast about the occurrences of a fictional paranormal activity research institution called the Magnus Institute. The audio show relayed horror stories from the Institute's archives and later moved into the Institute's connection with the supernatural entities it harbors. We got 5 seasons of the paranormal saga from 2016 to 2021, and each episode is presented in such a unique and captivating way that one cannot help but get utterly hooked. Magnus Archives was an exceedingly popular audio series. If Rusty Quill, the man who brought these stories to us, were to drop another season, folks would be right there, listening in from the very first cut. The most recent installment of this series is a sequel called The Magnus Protocol, which dropped in January 2024. A shout out must go to the creators of Magnus Archives for delivering this amazing body of work to us. The writer of the series, Jon Sims, has been a complete instrument of fright with the content. The stories he churns out make for short episodes, just under a half hour long, but a perfect listen, even on the go. Alexander J. Newell directed each episode with complete atmospheric angst that ensured the first and third seasons especially lived rent-free in my mind for days after I had listened to them. Where other creators may have chosen longer runtimes for their stories, cranking that ever-present creepy score in the back, Newell kept the episodes short and extremely well-paced. He also pulled back on the score so the listeners could pay attention to the voiceovers that perfectly capture the sense of fright all the stories are building the series up to. He only brought in that ill-boding background music in the moments when the horror was really shoring in. The constant crackling of the cassette tape sound was one of my favorite things about the sound design Newell used. It helped create a feeling of the bygone past, a grainy mood with a choppy air of helplessness and dread. Brilliant horror atmosphere in all. Given the series' popularity, the Magnus Archives role-playing game launched in October 2024 with Monte Cook Games. Monte Cook has released a gorgeous hardcover with all the details on the Magnus Archives world and the game you can imagine. Now, let us get into the meat of the Magnus Archives podcast. We'll delve into what this 5 seasons long, nerve-wracking tale is all about, the main characters, and some early episodes for you to chew on. Magnus Archives, the season's progression. The Magnus Archives pack in small, spooky stories with spine-chilling bits at the end that validate the paranormal entities in the story. There's also a meta-plot that links all the stories together. We're always getting more information on mysterious things within the Magnus Institute. As the listeners begin to relate to the main characters, they return to see what becomes of the spooky stuff going on around them, as much as the standalone stories. What will keep you locked into this podcast season after season season is the concept of the fears. All of the crazy, unnerving stuff that's going on in the Magnus Institute and with the subjects whose statements are kept on record in the archives have been caused by the supernatural manifestations called the fears. These fears are very real entities that exist in a separate dimension just outside of our own. The fears cannot survive without spreading and feeding on the people in our world, so they find ways and seep into our world. The concept isn't exactly brand new in the horror genre, not by any means, but the way the Magnus Archives sets it up through the stories is fantastic. The fears come inside our world by possessing or leeching onto people or objects that exist within our dimension. They also form avatars, which are basically people who work with the fears, like a collab of sorts. The fear becomes a part of these people. The fear patron lends some of its powers to its avatar. Now, there are 15 of these fear entities in all, which encompass all the things that people fear in this world. These are the buried, the corruption, the dark, the desolation, the eye, the flesh, the slaughter, the spiral, the hunt, the lonely, the stranger, the vast, the web, the end, and the extinction. The fears comprise the torment the namesake misgiving brings into a person. They manifest in a physical form and as the mental unease that accompanies the particular misgiving. For instance, the eye refers to the fear of somebody watching you. All of the things that fall into that category, like being stalked or followed, or having your deep, dark secrets exposed, are within the sphere of the dread the eyes conjures. This fear also extends to the human curiosity that seeks to be the eye, like someone wanting to know too much, the desire to unearth hidden things at the risk of being caught or even destroyed. What would you do if you were a victim of the eye, someone who watches you suffer and be terrorized and silently gorges itself on your suffering, growling all the more in strength for it? The eye can manifest in our dimension as anything that watches, like human eyes, cameras, books, or even surveillance equipment. The original story has changed quite a bit in the latest sequel, Magnus Protocol. There are new characters with a toxic workplace setting in a new timeline that's supposed to recount modern-day events. But in today's video, we will focus on the original Magnus Archives and its characters. Main characters: Jon Sims. The writer of the podcast, Jon Sims, has named the main character after himself and also does the voice for Sims' character, which I thought was pretty cool. Jon Sims is the head archivist of the Magnus Institute, and to start with, he truly seems to detest the position he's in. He does not believe all the supernatural hocus pocus. He's often sarcastic and short with the paranormal experiences of Magnus Institute subjects, but as the story develops and he begins to understand the uncanny stuff happening with these people and also within the Institute, he becomes more compassionate. Sasha James. An archival assistant to Jon, Sasha collects the proof needed to establish the validity of the cases at the Institute archives. In the episode Infestation, Sasha is supplanted with an entity called Non-Sasha. Non-Sasha takes on Sasha's entity using a different host body. Timothy Stoker, or Tim, is the second archival assistant. While he's a valuable researcher, during his tenure with the archives, he's seen to become cynical, disturbed even. He even acts out in anger sometimes, especially while interacting with Jon. Martin Blackwood. Martin is the third archival assistant to Jon, whom Jon initially considers more of a hindrance than assistance. Later on in the series, Martin and Jon become quite close. Martin is a reserved guy who doesn't do parties or other social gatherings all that well. Elias Bouchard. Elias is the head of the Magnus Institute. He tries to play it cool with the weird things in the Institute earlier in the series, but is later found to have a dark story of his own. He's one of those characters whose actions are so closely knit with the plot that I can't give you much more on him without spoiling things for you. So let's move on to Gertrude Robinson. Gertrude was the former head archivist of the Magnus Institute who went missing in 2015. Her fate was discovered later on by Martin. She had a cold demeanor and seemed to be all business. However, her real motives are slowly uncovered through successive seasons as Jon and his assistants try to learn more about her time at the Institute. Basira Hussein. I really like this character. Basira is a police officer, and she's got her principles clearly laid out. She is all about quit moaning about stuff, get up, and get working. She's assigned to the weird cases workload on the force, And what's more weird than the Magnus Institute cases, right? Well, she gets involved in cases that lead her to the Magnus Institute. Magnus Archives also has a bunch of side characters that are extremely memorable. Gerard Kier, or Jerry, is a fan favorite. Donning eye tats all over, with his badly dyed black hair and mommy issues, this character added an offbeat assortment to the story. Okay, so we're getting into spoiler territory now, okay? Be warned. We'll do a detailed breakdown of the first 2 episodes, but trust me when I tell you, these episodes are just the tip of the iceberg. There are way more notorious and bone-chilling stories as we go deeper into the first season and further down the later installments, especially seasons 3 and 4, with some downright ominous ones waiting for you. The Blanket Never Did Anything and Lost John's Cave are my favorites. Anywho, let's give you a head start with the leading 2. Anglerfish, Episode 1. The pilot episode introduces John's take on the Magnus Institute and its archiving department. It's a light episode that nevertheless sets a sinister tone for the series. Newly promoted to head archivist, Jon Sims is pretty annoyed with the state of the Magnus Institute's archives. The case files are vast, most of them unresolved mysteries, and all of them are handwritten. John is annoyed at Gertrude Robinson, the head of archiving before him, for not digitizing the files already, because now that burden falls on him. He begins the process aided by 3 assistants, Tim, Sasha, and Martin. John's attempts to put the audio on his laptop are met with strange audio disruptions, so he goes through the transcripts and puts them on tape. John considers the first statement by Nathan Waltz, a student who experienced a paranormal presence in the most distorted of settings. His story begins many years ago, April 2012 to be exact. Nathan and his friends had been at a party, and as can be expected of hale and hearty college young'uns, they had got drunk off their rockers. At some point in the night, Nathan decided to stagger home. He took the route that crosses through London's old fish market area. The way had quite a few steep hills, and Nathan ended up taking a nasty tumble down one. As he picked himself off the ground and got his bearings right, he heard a voice. This startled his beer-bathed senses. He wasn't aware that there was anyone out there other than him. He looked up at a dark alley, an offshoot from his road. A little further down the alley, there were some stairs going up with a light fixture above them, but the lights were out. There was a figure in the alley, but no light at all to show what this person was about. The figure swayed a little bit, as mirages do, and for a moment, Nathan felt that his inebriated mind was playing tricks on him. But then it said those words again. "Can I have a cigarette?" Nathan rolled a cigarette and held it out, but the figure didn't move any closer to him. As Nathan's eyes adjusted and zeroed in on the guy, he realized that his skin was sickly and sunken, and his whole vibe reminded him of an anglerfish. Hold tight, guys. Things are about to get creepier. The figure repeated the same cigarette request for the 3rd time, but this time, Nathan noticed that his mouth didn't move a smidge. The figure's feet weren't even touching the ground. It was just gliding over from side to side. Watching this was like a scary wake-up call for Nathan's dehydrated wits. He darted out of there straight home. Nathan nursed the hangover till the following morning. When he found himself workable and upright, he returned to the old fish market in the brightness of the morning. There was no sign to point to anything weird happening around there, but he did see a rolled-up Marlboro lying under the stairs up ahead in the alleyway he had witnessed the night before. Over the next few days, Nathan researched the hell out of this thing. He even talked to some friends about what had happened to him that night, but people just looked back at him like he was nuts. Then something happened that validated Nathan's bizarre experience. A student, John Fellow from Nathan's college, went missing. This guy was at the same party Nathan had gone to the night of his encounter with the floating figure. Later, the police found that John Fellow had gone missing around the old fish market area. In John's missing person picture, Nathan curiously peeped a pack of Marlboros sticking out of his pocket. That was the end of Nathan's statement. John wasn't convinced by the story of a drunken college guy at all, but he did notice that the police had found 6 disappearances in the old fish market area over time. One of the people disappearing, Ashley Dobson's last picture before the disappearance, was taken by her and sent to her sister from the same dark alley that Nathan had described. She was standing with the murky alleyway in the back saying, "Check out this drunk creeper, LOL." But there was no one in the picture in the alley behind her. It was dark and empty. When Nathan's assistant Sasha ran Ashley's picture through some editing programs, increasing the contrast to an excessively high level, it revealed the outline of a long, thin hand there. Wow, that mental image just made my skin crawl all over again. The next episode, however, gets even more unsettling. Do Not Open, Episode 2. This episode is about the statement of Joshua Gillespie, the man who had to accept the unnatural in his home and design his life around it to survive. It's the mystery of a wooden casket that he possessed for a great amount of time. And once you see how he did it, you're going to want to applaud this man. The statement is from November 1998. Joshua had gone to Amsterdam along with his friends. They went all out with the Amsterdam package, as most carefree 20-somethings would. But Joshua, an architecture student, was not quite as whacked out on drugs as the other guys. One morning, while the others were out cold, he decided to go for a walk around the city. It was a bright day, and Joshua enjoyed the architectural marvels of Amsterdam, losing himself in the charming back streets of the city. By the time he worked his way back to the area he was lodging in, it was evening. He stopped at a cafe, and at this point in the story, time becomes a bit of a blur. Joshua had no clue how long he was at the cafe, but it had become fully dark outside. He also cannot recall exactly when he realized he wasn't alone at his table. The man sitting opposite to him was short, with brown hair and an intent stare. He said his name was John, and he too was an Englishman inside a foreign land. He asked Joshua to do him a favor and keep a package for him. Joshua was wary of this odd request, but as John pulled out an envelope with £10,000, Joshua quickly agreed. Even though he had given in to temptation, over the next few days, Joshua got real uneasy with this whole deal with this stranger. He also had no clue how to return the money, as he hadn't exchanged any details with John. Joshua waited for John to approach him again, but that never happened. So he returned to England and went on with his life, never touching John's money for anything at all. A year later, though, Joshua got an entry-level job in Bournemouth, a seaside town with high rents. Joshua couldn't afford an apartment on his own, so he decided to dip into the wad John had given him, what felt like ages ago. Joshua got himself a nice one-bedroom, and everything seemed to be going just fine. About a week later, Joshua heard the doorbell as he cut fruit for his breakfast. At his doorbell were two towering red-faced delivery men carrying a heavy 2-meter-long package. They didn't answer Joshua's queries, but simply put the package inside the apartment and left. When Joshua cut open the tape over the package, a coffin came into view. There was a thick chain around it, fastened with a lock. The lock was closed, but the key was in the hole. Just over the coffin lid, there were some words scratched into the wood. They read, "Do not open." There was also a folded note signed by a certain J, who Joshua figured was John. Joshua froze with fear. He went through several motions with his heart in his mouth, but he decided to place the casket in his living room. He chose to pay heed to the warning, not to open the thing. Smart man. He took the key out of the lock and kept it far away from it. He had to make good of the deal with John, a promise he knew he couldn't escape. As time went by, Joshua went from being up in knots about the coffin to becoming cool with its presence, but he remained steadfast in curbing his curiosity to undo the lock and look inside the coffin. One day, Joshua unthinkingly put his orange juice on the coffin. Immediately, he felt a movement under the glass. A scratching sound came from inside the coffin. It went on for a while, even after he removed the glass. Joshua was terror-stricken once again. He wondered what was inside the coffin and how that thing was still alive after being sealed in for so long. All the answers to his questions petrified him, so that he willed himself to stop thinking about them. One of the parts that got me really spooked in this story was the time it rained in Bournemouth. Joshua described it as hard rain that set a gloom all over the town. And suddenly, Joshua heard a low moan, almost like a melodious song, coming from the coffin. The moaning continued the whole time that it rained. After that, the moaning happened every time it rained. Joshua would go into his room and pump up some music to drown out the sound. Joshua may have had a weak moment accepting that cash from John back in Amsterdam, but watching the way he held his nerve, handling a fear entity in his apartment like that, the guy was a certified trooper. He even said it himself, that his experience with that wooden coffin and whatever was inside it shows that you can get used to anything if you have to, no matter how bizarre. For me, Joshua's crowning moment came when I saw the side effects of this tense and fear-filled time in his life. In his statement, he goes on to say that he could no longer sleep. Bad dreams haunted his nights. He would often wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, and worse still, he started sleepwalking. Every so often, he would wake up and find himself standing in his living room, looking down over the coffin. It was as though the thing inside the coffin was beckoning to him. Once he woke and found that he had the key inside the padlock and was about to turn it open. Lucid of mind, even as he trembled with fear, Joshua took the key and put it in a big bowl of water, and then stuck the bowl of water in his deep freeze. A genius move. The cold touch of ice would always wake him as he tried to get the keys sleepwalking. He lived like this, alone all the time, in a deep blue fright for a year. Then, one day, Jon and his 2 delivery men showed up at Joshua's doorstep. Jon seemed impressed by the way Joshua had handled the fear. The delivery men went in, and there was some screaming from the coffin. Joshua did not peep to see what they were doing. He just wanted them to take it away and be done with it. A van marked Beacon and Hope deliveries took the coffin away, and Joshua finally had his life back. Joshua Gillespie's statement ended here, but Jon, still the cynic, did not believe the man. He found no corroborating evidence or witnesses to support Joshua's story. Tim, Jon's assistant, found out that the courier service, Beacon and Hope Deliveries, did exist, but had long since closed shop. Another strange thing Tim found was that for the entire duration of Joshua's stay in the Bournemouth building, he was absolutely alone over there. There was not a single other tenant in that building then, or even after he left. Why would a building with so many flats have only one guy renting? I will leave that puzzle for you guys to crack. Star rating: 4.5 out of 5. The podcast amps its scare quotient to top shelf every episode and keeps it up there throughout the series. That's a hard thing to pull off. There's literally nothing negative I can say about the Magnus Archives. The sound design, writing and voiceovers, pacing, and everything else is well thought out. Brilliant content overall. We stamp the series Marvelous approved with 4.5 stars. Marvelous verdict. One thing that I found especially enticing about the Magnus Archives was the way each subsequent episode got spookier as the series progressed. Yes, there were some episodes that stand out overall, like Lost John's Cave, but the way the podcast starts off, it really eases the viewer in before pulling out the big guns. We also gradually learn about the dread lurking within the Institute and in the tunnels under it at a gradual pace. The Magnus Archives is a horror fanatic's dream podcast. I haven't quite got into anything exclusively audio-wise like this that got me so jittery. I was literally jumping out of my chair at the smallest sounds as I went through this. But I'd also tuned in late at night, totally alone in the house, so there might have been a lapse of judgment there. The Magnus Archives is as legit as it gets. I mean, if this isn't already a campsite storytime favorite, I don't know what y'all are doing out there. Alright, that's all from us on the Magnus Archives today. I hope you've had as much fun hanging out with us as we had making this video for you. If you liked this video, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one. Peace.